Generally, criminal profilers at the Federal Bureau of Investigation categorize serial murderers into two different types: organized and disorganized killers. Organized killers tend to have an above-average intelligence ranging from 105 to 120. They often plan their crimes quite methodically and will usually abduct their victims. Also, organized serial killers often kill the victim in one place and then stage the body or dispose the body in another place. They might also be geographically mobile and may go to great lengths to make their crimes difficult to discover. For example, they might falsify suicide notes or set up others to take the blame for their crimes. Organized killers are also socially adequate. They might live with a partner or date frequently. Typically, male organized serial killers do not have problems connecting with others. At least on a superficial level, they are able to do this. Some organized serial killers may be stable father figures, college educated, and have good hygiene and good housekeeping skills. They often have daytime habits. They are diurnal, meaning that they sleep at night and are active during the day. Also, organized serial killers often lure the victims with ploys, appealing to their sense of sympathy. Ted Bundy often did this. He would occasionally win the trust of his victims by acting hurt or using a false cast. Throughout his career of murder, Ted Bundy was a textbook example of an organized serial killer, though he would later regress and become disorganized right before being apprehended in Florida. Organized serial killers also tend to follow their crimes in the media carefully and often take pride in their actions as if it were a grand project. Organized serial killers may even return to the crime scene to see what police have done, and they might even contact the police or the media. For example, Dennis Rader, otherwise known as the BTK killer, contacted the police through newspaper ads. Ultimately, this would lead to his apprehension. He used a computer that was traced to a Lutheran church where he was a respected member. Organized killers such as Dennis Rader tend to be very concerned with presenting themselves in a very favorable light to other people. Dennis Rader held a governmental position and would occasionally give reports on the local news. He would even try to use his position to impose his will on other people. For example, Rader had a woman's dog euthanized even though she was on her way to pick up her beloved pet. Also, Rader would patrol the city neighborhoods and hand out notices informing households that their grass was too long. Because organized serial killers are concerned with their outward appearances, they are likely to drive flashy cars and often dress in expensive clothing. Also, they may be police groupies or wannabe police officers. Kenneth Bianchi, who is another textbook example of an organized serial killer, tried to get on to several police departments, though he was unsuccessful in doing this. Organized serial killers may be loners. However, if they are loners, it is often by choice because they feel superior to other people. Organized killers are also sexually competent, and they are more likely than disorganized serial killers to dismember the corpse of their victim. Organized serial killers may also personify their victims. For example, they tend to select victims according to a specific preference. Ted Bundy, for instance, often killed women who had long brown hair that was parted in the middle. The reason he chose victims with this style of hair is because it reminded him of his ex-girlfriend, who had rejected him earlier. Organized serial killers may also be considered to be likable. They are capable of striking up a conversation with a stranger, and they present themselves as non-threatening. They are the type of people who, when captured, are most likely to be described by acquaintances as a really nice guy. In fact, I would strongly recommend that you read the book The Stranger Beside Me by Ann Rule. Ann Rule actually had a friendship with Ted Bundy. They worked together at a suicide hotline, and he even walked her to her car at night. In her book, Rule maintains that she had absolutely no inkling that Ted Bundy could have been capable of harming anyone, let alone being a multiple murderer for that matter. Now, let us talk about disorganized serial killers. Disorganized serial killers often have a low intelligence that ranges between 80 to 95. The disorganized killer often does not hunt for a specific type of victim. Rather, he will murder someone whenever the opportunity arises. Also, disorganized killers rarely bother to dispose of the body. Instead, they just leave it at the same place where they found the victim. Disorganized killers also carry out blitz attacks. They might leap out and attack an individual without any warning. And disorganized serial killers rarely bother to cover their tracks. Still, even though these killers are sloppy, they may manage to avoid capture. Disorganized serial killers are often socially inadequate with a few friends, and they may often have a history of mental problems. They are often regarded by acquaintances as eccentric or even a bit creepy. Also, disorganized serial killers tend to have sex with the victim's corpse after death, whereas organized killers tend to have sex with or rape the victim before the homicide actually occurs. Usually, disorganized serial killers tend to live alone and most do not date. They also tend to have poor hygiene and poor housekeeping skills. They tend to be nocturnal and are out at night when others are sleeping. They often drive a clunky car or a pickup truck. Disorganized serial killers might return to the crime scene, but if they do this, it is usually to relive memories. They do not return to the scene of the crime to see what the police are up to. Also, disorganized serial killers often leave their victim's corpse intact. Once they have murdered the individual, they consider the mission to be over. They are typically not concerned with staging, dismembering, or moving the body. Interestingly, some disorganized serial killers will occasionally make attempts to contact their victims' family members to taunt them and play games. They also tend to have very little insight into their crimes and may even block out the memories of the killings. Usually, disorganized serial killers are high school dropouts. Interestingly, though, they often keep a diary. Investigators will look for these diaries once they have apprehended their suspect. Disorganized serial killers also tend to be fascinated with self-help programs, particularly those of the Alcoholics Anonymous variety, which mix religious elements with the group dynamics of self-improvement. After Jeffrey Dahmer was apprehended and sentenced to a correctional facility, he became extremely interested in Christianity and volunteered often at the prison chapel. Dahmer exhibited aspects of both an organized and disorganized serial killer. Jeffrey Dahmer was organized because he would often go to nightclubs and lure his male victims to his apartment. Therefore, Dahmer had at least some type of social competence. Also, Dahmer often dismembered his victims, which is a characteristic of an organized serial killer. However, there is strong evidence which points to the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer had severe mental problems. He was disorganized because he would store the body parts of his victims in his apartment. In fact, Dahmer's neighbors claimed that the smell was horrendous. Nevertheless, they assumed incorrectly that the smell was simply due to bad cooking. Disorganized serial killers also tend to murder their victims in distinct ways. Their victims are often battered about the face, and sometimes they are even blindfolded. This shows that disorganized serial killers often have a need to depersonalize the victim. Also, if a disorganized serial killer chooses to blindfold his victim, it could be because the victim might possibly resemble someone in the killer's life for whom he feels a sense of anger or fear. Disorganized serial killers also leave footprints, fingerprints, and sometimes even the murder weapon at the crime scene. If they do not leave the weapon at the scene of the crime, investigators may be likely to find it closely nearby. Often the crime scene itself will be chaotic and in a total sense of disarray. Ironically, disorganized serial killers may often be difficult to catch because while the organized offender is predictable in some way, the disorganized offender tends not to be as predictable. Some criminal profilers suggest that it is possible for a disorganized serial killer to improve his mental state enough that he becomes an organized serial killer. Nevertheless, it is much more likely that an organized serial killer will deteriorate over time and become disorganized. As alluded to earlier, Ted Bundy was initially extremely organized. In fact, Bundy was so organized that police never located the crime scenes where his first 17 victims were killed. 6 of his victims remain missing to this day. Bundy once referred to himself as the only PhD in serial murder. He had been attending law school when police finally identified him. He was exceptionally intelligent, having once worked for a state Republican committee as a consultant. However, Ted Bundy would eventually commit the Chi Omega sorority house murders at Florida State University, where he used a log that he found at the crime scene as his murder weapon. Bundy also left incriminating bite marks on one of his victims' body. The fact that he would leave so much evidence illustrates that Bundy had regressed to a disorganized serial killer by the time he committed these murders. In the crime classification manual, a third category is presented, the mixed offender. It is suggested that the reasons for those offenders who cannot be easily discriminated as organized or disorganized are varied. The attack may involve more than one offender. There may be unanticipated events that the offender had not planned for. The victim may resist, or the offender may escalate into a different pattern during the course of an offense or over a series of offenses. The suggestion is that in this sort of crime, although there may be some evidence of planning, there will be poor concealment of the body. The crime scene might be in great disarray, and there will be a great deal of manual violence committed against the victim. The offender may be young or involved in drugs or alcohol. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, is a perfect example of a mixed serial killer who killed 19 people between June 1984 and August of 1985. He killed his victims in their homes at random, not always sure whom he would find when he entered houses. He overcame them with a fast blitz attack using extreme force. He left many of his victims alive, suggesting that when he made a decision to kill, he made it spontaneously at the scene. He did not disguise his face and left forensic evidence behind. On the other hand, Ramirez brought weapons to the scene and even carried a police frequency scanner, traits of an organized offender. Critics of the organized-disorganized model argue that the mixed category demonstrates the weakness of the system, since too many serial killers do not fit into the neat categories and are thus classified as mixed. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the model for classifying offenders as disorganized, organized, or mixed was only the beginning of an effort to classify serial killers. There are other ways of classifying serial killers for psychological or criminological study. However, this model is widely accepted among most criminal investigative analysts at the FBI.